evening and welcome SMAC Nation to our show. Today's show entitled 21st Century Policing, Improving Police and Community Relations is a part two to an original show which aired last year in July. If you saw that show, then you can recall how animated, how interesting, how energized both the panelists and the viewers were. So if you also recall, that show went quite long. I will try my best and diligently try to keep us down to an hour, maybe an hour and 10 minutes, if possible. When we aired the part one series, we were just coming off of the death and murder of George Floyd. And a couple months before that, the death of Breonna Taylor. And so since that time, we've had a few other things that have occurred within our community. And I'll just name a few of those incidents. January, there was Lamont Moses, who was approached by officers while he was asleep in his vehicle, and he tried to flee the scene after being caught with marijuana and was killed by the Newcastle County officers in Wilmington, Delaware. We have the situations that occurred in Rochester, New York with the 9-year-old girl who was handcuffed and pepper sprayed. We also had the Daniel Prude incident, who was a Chicagoan who visited Rochester who had a psychotic episode. And we also had in April, a Micaiah Bryant, the 16-year-old who was swinging a knife, actually attacking another person who was shot and killed by Officer Reardon in Columbus, Ohio. And then we had recently seen footage, it happened, I believe, back in December, of the Army lieutenant who was pepper sprayed by police officers for a traffic stop. So according to Newsweek magazine, 181 Blacks have been killed by the police since George Floyd's death. Numbers gathered between 2013 and 2020 indicate that Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people, despite being 1.3 times likely to be unarmed than white people. Specifically in Chicago, police kill Black people at the rate of 22 times more than that of whites. Of the police killings documented in 2020, traffic stops were listed as the initial police encounter in 121 deaths. So when we hear incidents like this, we hear statistics like this, some of us will think we have a serious problem here between the police and the Black community in particular. Our people have marched, we've protested for decades, and in some of the people's eyes, it looks like little has actually changed. Well, I wanted to take the time to have a part 2 series because I think this is actually a very important topic, and that's why I've asked the law enforcement executives here on this panel, who, by the way, I admire dearly, to shed some light on some of these issues perhaps, and to perhaps help us understand what ways we can actually improve the relationship between the police and the community. So I want to start right now by introducing our panel here. We have to start with Chief Elvin Barren. The city of Southfield appointed Elvin V. Barren as the Chief of Police on Monday, July 29, 2019. Chief Barren previously served as the Deputy Chief of the Detroit Police Department, where he commanded 5 precincts, 8 specialized units: SWAT, Bomb Squad, K9, Air Support, Harbor Master, Traffic Enforcement, Tactical Response Unit, and the Citywide Parks Detail. Chief Barren holds a master's degree from Bowling Green State University, a bachelor's degree from Central Michigan University, and an associate's degree from Wayne County Community College. He is a graduate of the Senior Management Institute for Police and a graduate of the Leadership in Counterterrorism program, sponsored by the FBI. Chief Barren is also a veteran of the United States Navy, serving 8 years as an operations specialist. Thank you, Chief Barren, for joining us this evening. Next up, we have Chief Mitchell Davis. Mitchell R. Davis III is currently the Chief of Police for the village of Hazel, Crest, Illinois, located just outside of the south side of Chicago. Chief Davis is the president of the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police. He is the first Black president in the 80-year history of the statewide organization. Congratulations. He is also a representative for the organization on Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton's Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative, which addresses criminal justice reform. He also serves as a representative on the Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul's working group on legislation for law enforcement licensing, and with the General Assembly of Legislators on Illinois HB 3653 on criminal justice reform. Chief Davis is currently completing his dissertation on the effect of police culture on their relationship with the Black community for his PhD in organizational leadership at Concordia University of Chicago. He also holds a master's degree of science in criminal justice from the University of Cincinnati and a Bachelor of Arts degree from Governor State University. He is also a graduate of Northwestern University School of Police Staff and Command, Class 182. Chief Davis was recognized in 2018 as Police Chief of the Year by the Illinois State Crime Commission, and in 2019, he received the Jefferson Award for Lifetime Achievement in Public Service. Chief Davis serves as a subject matter expert for the evaluation of the Louisville Metropolitan Police Department after the police killing of Breonna Taylor. Chief Davis is married and has 4 adult children and 4 grandchildren. He is a man that is led by his faith in God in all aspects of his life. In his free time, he is an avid boater and he loves to travel. He is also a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. Thank you, Chief Davis, for joining us this evening. Next up, we have Chief Cynthia Herriott-Sullivan. Cynthia Herriott-Sullivan currently serves as the Chief of Police for the city of Rochester, New York. She is a criminal justice process improvement professional with years of experience in the field of criminal justice and organizational problem solving. She served as the chair of the Unite Rochester Justice Engagement, which examines issues of racial disparity in the criminal justice process and develops solutions. She managed the development of the first Community Court Academy and the Community Justice Forum, both with the intent goal of addressing disparity in the criminal justice system, and also helped develop the Community Response Team, which works with the community leaders to respond to issues of community unrest. She is the former Deputy Director of the National Drug Court Institute in Metro Washington, D.C. She has years of experience in law enforcement, conducting a number of internal investigations as part of the Critical Incident Investigations Team, which investigated law enforcement and custody deaths. She has worked with the court systems and law enforcement around the United States and internationally, assisting both with working together more effectively. She developed NDCI's National Law Enforcement Task Force, which was formed to support law enforcement executives in developing effective criminal justice policy and operating procedures, and developed the concept for NDCI's law enforcement curriculum, a training program aimed at assisting law enforcement to strategically work with the specialty courts. She is a member of the International Association Chiefs of Police, the National Sheriff's Association, and serves on the Government Affairs and Drug Enforcement Committees. She served for several years as a member of the Federal Department of Homeland Security State and Local Law Enforcement Training Advisory Committee, an organization that selects the training curriculum of law enforcement agencies around the country. She holds a Master's of Science degree. Thank you, Chief Herriott-Sullivan, for joining us this evening. And last but certainly not least, we have Assistant Commissioner Booker Hodges. Booker Hodges is an Assistant Commissioner for the Department of Public Safety. Assistant Commissioner Hodges joins DPS after serving as the interim chief of police for the city of Prior Lake. His experience also includes time with the Minnesota State Fair Police, the Dakota and Ramsey County Sheriff's offices as well. He has a wide range of experience working as a school resource officer, a patrol deputy, narcotics detective, SWAT operator, patrol overnight watch commander, inspector, under sheriff, and acting chief deputy. Hodges spent 5 years as the president of the Minneapolis NAACP, becoming the first police officer to serve as a branch president. Hodges is active in the community, serving on several non-for-profit boards of directors. He is also the president of the Minnesota chapter of the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Executives, NOBLE. He is an adjunct professor at the University of Northwestern at St. Paul. Hodges has a doctorate in public administration from Hemline University, a master's degree from St. Mary's University, and a bachelor's degree from Florida Southern College. Hodges is a Minnesota native, and he and his wife have 2 sons. Hodges enjoys teaching, mentoring, and mediating complex issues between individuals and organizations. Assistant Commissioner Hodges oversees the Alcohol and Gambling Enforcement, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and the Minnesota State Patrol. Thank you, Assistant Commissioner, for joining us this evening. Wow, we got some real heavy hitters here, and I am so pleased to have you here this evening. So, without further ado, I want to go right into the panel, and we'll start with you, Chief Barren. One of the things that upset the community with respect to the George Floyd incident is that none of the officers stepped in to stop Officer Chauvin. In June of last year, you instituted a revised policy within the Southfield Police Department where if an officer is there, they witness a police in misconduct, and they fail to intervene, they will be held accountable just as if they were the ones who actually applied the abuse of force. This was also applauded by Governor Whitmer of Michigan. With this policy revision, how has this change been received by your department, and what has the community, or how has the community responded to this change?
Yes, and thank you for bringing this up. Certainly the duly intervene policy is very important post Mr. George Floyd's murder. I always say that police chiefs set the tone for the organization. So it's important that I act very quickly to set a standard for the Southfield Police Department. So the duly intervene was implemented. I did take time to visit each officer on each shift as I rolled out this new policy. And I had the conversation with them so that they heard from me what the expectation was from the police chief. And so you ask, well, how do the officers respond? Well, between the unions and the officers, it was a unified front. Chief, this is the right thing to do, and we support this policy. And so that was important because sometimes when policies are implemented, you may get pushback from unions, officers, but it was good that it was a united front that this was the right thing to do. But my efforts did not stop there. And so it was important that this policy was shared, and not only shared locally, but nationally. So my next step was to send the policy to the Michigan Association of Chiefs of Police so that they can get it out to all Michigan police chiefs. I did an interview with the local news channel, and then that story went national. And then I started getting calls from police chiefs from around the country to include also legislative individuals who wanted to further the policy in discussions of police reform. And so the community was very receptive of this. I mentioned before, police chiefs setting the tone, but we have to have the courage to change the culture of organization. Because I want to be very clear what's going on in the country as regards to policing. The fact of the matter is, the history of policing, there is a culture of racism and police brutality. And so we have to admit that, and then we need to start working on processes and policies, such as some of the reforms presented, to change that culture of behavior.
Thank you very much. You have a few more minutes if you want to elaborate on anything else you want to discuss with respect to your department or just in general of what's happening, in the country.
Well, I want to spend my last few minutes talking about youth engagement, which is very important, particularly in this environment. Right now, our youth are angry, they're confused, and they're wanting to know, why is law enforcement projected in this light? And so it's important for us as leaders to start the process of engaging youth as we talk about police reforms, building relationships with the schools in our particular districts, and then having youth engagement activities. And just to let you know that we put action to words, and I'll just talk very briefly of the newest youth engagement project we had on May 4th and May 15th, where we brought in our youth. We did simulated traffic stops. And the reason for this was to show them the ways, the ideas of why law enforcement conduct traffic stops. As you mentioned earlier in your earlier comments, the volume of traffic stops that interact our youth. And so how should they interact with law enforcement was a topic. What are their rights as it relates to being stopped by law enforcement? We broadened the conversation discussing this epidemic of road rage that's happening across the country, what to do involved in traffic accidents. So a wide range of topics, and that way we're engaging our youth. They're starting to see us in the role that we designed for as leaders in the community, and it's going to take time to start developing trust in our youth. Yes. So the overnight fix, but I think if we continue to ensure that accountability is taking place, ensure that we are honest with the community if there's an incident, because the other layer to all of this discussion was with the Southfield Police Department. Within 8 months of my arrival, the department is now fully deployed in body cameras with the expectation and policy that with any interaction with the community, those body cams will be activated. And so just another layer that we can add in of trust. And again, if something happens, be honest about it, show the video, which is really becoming a national standard, and then assuring the community that we are going to be transparent in any police activity that causes concern.
Yeah, very good. I know for years, when body cams first came on the scene, there was a lot of reservation, a lot of hesitation, not just with law enforcement, but even with the community, because, and I have some family members that are in law enforcement. They said they had no problem wearing the body cam because sometimes they want people to see the whole story, because what you get on film sometimes from a citizen's recording may just be, what their cousin recorded of what happened when the police did this, as opposed to the whole story of how did it get to that point. So instituting, I think, a national requirement, I think would be a good thing, at least for us to get the complete story so that you can better assess the entire situation. So thank you with that. Next, we're going to move on to Chief Davis. So you stated that the goal of the Hazel Crest Police Department is to provide the best service to the community as possible, and that the foundation of achieving this goal has to be through relationships. What do you think should be done to improve these relationships, and specifically with the Black community?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on such an esteemed panel with my colleagues here, and Michelle, you as well. for inviting me, my friend. But I believe that almost everything in life revolves around relationships. That's just my belief. Relationships are how things get done. Lack of relationship is why things don't get done. Once again, not just in law enforcement, but in almost every aspect of our lives. And as far as relationships with the community, as Chief just said a minute ago, there's a history that exists, that's interwoven into the fabric of law enforcement that we have to deal with. That history that started, with slave catchers and progressed to Jim Crow, when in the 60s and the 50s, 60s, when the people who were enforcing Jim Crow laws with kids and mothers and fathers in their Sunday best being beat with sticks and dogs put on them, that was the police doing that. And they were doing it to us and those who stood with us. And, going forward, we look at the war against crime, war against drugs and getting tough on crime, which led to disproportionate incarceration of people of color. And then you look at other systemic things that the entire criminal justice system has interwoven. Back in the 80s and 90s, when crack cocaine ravaged our communities and destroyed families, society looked at that as, that's a bunch of folks that's doing stuff they ain't got no business doing. They shouldn't have been doing drugs. Sorry, but they should have been doing drugs. Well, now that we have an opioid crisis, it's now a health epidemic. And all these resources are being given to those, because it's in everybody's community now. It's not just in our communities, but that's just an example of how there are so many systemic things that are interwoven in the criminal justice system. So it's a hard nut to crack, but it's a relationship that has to exist. I share with folks that, the most challenged communities want the police there, but they don't want the police there at any cost. It can't be whatever we need to do, because I've heard people say, well, how do they expect us to get rid of people? We're not stopping everybody. Well, no, there's a way to do our jobs whereby we are dealing with those who are criminals. We police those who are criminals, and we serve everybody else in the community. Because once again, in the most challenged communities, most people that live there are good people who are living in that situation. They're getting up, going to work every day. They're trying to feed their families. They want the best for their family. They're not out there doing bad things. And we can't just do whatever we want by any means necessary and use that as justification. So we have to, so for me, the relationship deals with culture. Chief said it already. The culture within law enforcement has to change. I was sitting on a panel a couple hours ago, got an honor to be on an interview with Jacob Blake's dad, the young man who was shot in the back in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So a couple hours ago I was on, and it was just, it was so touching how, in spite of what happened to this man's son, he just wants the right. He's not hating on the police. He's about, hey, we got to get this right. We have to develop relationship between law enforcement and our communities, because they need us. They need us, but they need us in the right way. And in order to get that done, it is my belief that it's you can't turn the ship on a dime. It's got to be a gradual change. So it's been messed up a long time. We're not going to change it overnight. So legislation kind of sets some guidelines that allow us to right the ship. But addressing that culture has to be bold. And once again, Chief, I'm copying your stuff, man. We talk about leadership. We've got to have courageous leaders that are in charge, leaders like my panelists, my fellow panelists here, that are over their police departments, who do things unapologetically to address the concerns and needs that have historically not been met by our communities. And in doing that, and once again, Chief, I'm stealing your stuff, man, we got to make sure that we tell our people, they need to know what our values are. You as a leader, they have to know your values. I have a thing that I kind of also stole from the Illinois State Trooper Academy, has a plaque up in their gym. And it says, once you chose the career of law enforcement, you gave up the right not to be physically fit. And we know that's not true, because we've seen, I'm just joking, but it's true. Laughing but serious. But I use that, and I kind of reword it. When you became a member of law enforcement, you gave up the right to express bias. And that doesn't mean that we won't have biases, but it says that as a leader, Chief Davis is not going to allow it to happen in the Hazel Crest Police Department. And if it does, there's consequences. And I tell people who I lead that we've got challenges out there. And if you make a mistake, there's consequences for mistakes. Especially, we literally hold the power of life and death in our hands. And if you make a mistake, there are consequences. And as a chief, I will make sure that you have a procedurally just process in which you're held accountable. That I assure you. But if I find out that you're intentionally doing something, I'm not going to throw you in front of the bus. I'm going to hold you down in front of the bus, because I need for everybody to know that I'm holding you down in front of the bus. And it's me, because I'm not going to tolerate what's happening. So we've got to change the culture, and those through attrition is one way. We got leadership in place. The attrition, the old guard, the ones who need to go, they need to go. We hear about folks that, with these legislative change, I'm just going to go ahead and retire. Well, a lot of those folks who said that need to go ahead and retire. And when they leave, those young people that we have coming in, we've got to have a safe environment whereby all law enforcement officers can not just report misconduct, but act immediately on misconduct. When George Floyd was murdered, you hear the story about the one guy, I think it was one of them, who, he's only been out of the academy for a week. What stopped him from intervening? Wrong is wrong. The culture stopped him from intervening. There's a 24 or however many year veteran that was doing something. Yeah, he saw, but you know what? I'm still my FTO. Who am I to say something? So we've got to develop systems and processes, like the chief was saying, whereby everybody is held accountable and encouraged in a safe manner to not just report stuff after it happened. When something happens, you need to intervene. And by doing these things, now the community will see, well, maybe they are serious. We've got the trial where the chief and other officers came forth and they testified against Derek Chauvin. That's a change right there. So, it's going to happen in increments, but we've got to have uncomfortable conversations. We got to go into uncomfortable environments and talk to the community and talk to them and let them know that we are serious, and we got to prove it on a day-to-day basis. And I believe that's just the beginning on how we can try to develop relationship with the community, especially communities of color, and move forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think you're spot on. Same with Chief Barren, both of you just on point with that. So appreciate that insight and input. I'm going to move on to Chief Herriott-Sullivan. And in your law enforcement career, oh, by the way, let me stop to say that congratulations on being the first African-American chief of police of Rochester, New York. So I think that is another huge accomplishment that needs to be recognized here. So we thank you for your service here in Rochester. But in your law enforcement career, you have developed mentoring programs for officers. You've spearheaded projects to address domestic violence, and you've led efforts to better connect law enforcement with the people that they serve. Can you share with us some of those activities that were put in place that help bridge that gap between the community and the police?
Sure. And again, thank you for inviting me. Really honored to be here amongst these heavy hitters that you named, some impressive resumes. I do want to clarify that I'm the first Black woman to run the department, and actually the first woman chief, but I expect to have many follow me. So I'll put that out there for now. So I also want to give some acknowledgement to Chief Davis. I've known him for a while, and as soon as this news broke, he was right on the phone to me, being encouraging and offering his support. So I want to thank him again for being there for me. I really appreciate it. So one thing I've really been passionate about, and quite frankly, why I left law enforcement the first time, was that I hate redundancy and wasted effort, and to keep doing things over and over again and not having an impact on the problem. And so for me, a lot of that involved understanding as a person of color, a Black woman, and then the justice system and how law enforcement is really at the nexus of that. We're really often the first contact that people have with the justice process. So we have a major impact with that. And so I think our voices are critical to sounding the alarm when we see certain problems that are repetitive and we don't have a way to deal with them. So for me, a lot of those things you talked about was seeing how the difficulty in police and law enforcement and community coming together and the things that were common as a result of that. And when we look at things like mentoring, how you speak to people, how you take time to have some empathy when you're dealing with the public, knowing that for many of them, their contacts with law enforcement weren't necessarily pleasurable ones. Or one of my other colleagues brought up a point that many of us have relatives who are still alive that were around to see law enforcement participate in racist gangs, such as the Ku Klux Klan. And so, and actually, now that I think about it, I do remember reading this story. And I still have the article, it was just a couple of years ago that in Florida, I can't remember the city, but the FBI had a wiretap up on another case. But what came up in that was that the police deputy chief and a police captain in a police department were members of the Ku Klux Klan in that area. And, once they, made the arrest on their case, then they went to the department and they were arrested for that. And obviously they lost their jobs. And that was only several years ago. So if anyone wants to say that these are things that happened years ago and, get over it, then I would challenge you to read cases like that. I mean, where it's clear that those things still occur. So in looking at things like mentoring, we want officers to be able to communicate with people, to, like I said, have empathy in how they deal with the public, and because it's a long-lasting impression that they're going to leave, and it builds relationship credit in the bank, so that when we do go through tough times, these are people that have been exposed, and they're going to say, well, my dealings have been positive. They're willing to at least keep an open mind until they hear the whole story. But without that, there's nothing to build on, and we're going to run into problems. So in looking at things like also domestic violence, for me, that was where I saw a gap where that was a major way that women mainly, but also men as well, had to deal with the justice process, but more so as victims. And if our response was inadequate, then obviously that leaves a major impact and does some damage. Often people are leaving their homes under some very chaotic circumstances. They have kids to consider, and if the response there is woefully inadequate, that's also going to leave you with a lasting impression on the Justice Department. And then the other major area for me was in looking at things like the things that many of us have family members that suffer with. It's also pretty current in this environment right now, which is behavioral health issues, co-occurring disorders. One thing I learned that was really had an impact on me was when I went to work for this criminal justice nonprofit in DC, and I was going through some training with things like co-occurring disorder, and I came to understand that people with behavioral health issues often, when it came to alcohol and drugs, they were self-medicating for some of their diagnosis. But that was new for me. And I also remembered this instructor is very skilled in pharmacology. And he said that you come in, you tell, you're the police, and you tell people to get off the corner. They come back and you're mad. He said, but the voice that's calling for the drugs is a lot louder than yours. And I thought about that. I said, we're policing to deal with the issue, but we really weren't strategizing our approach to consider the population we were dealing with. They were addicted. And the drug voice was calling pretty loud, especially if they had a behavioral health issue and they were hearing voices, and the certain type of drug they took helped the voice go away, at least lower the voice. I mean, those were all important things that we had to consider. So for me moving forward, I thought, if I'm pushing for law enforcement strategies, it's going to take into account the realities of the community and the people we're dealing with. I mean, if that's insanity, right? We keep telling people get off the corner. I mean, we should, address that because there are quality of life issues. Right. But my thing was to do it in a sustainable way so that you solve the problem and you're not constantly having your staff come back. And aren't those the times that we would look at an increased likelihood that there's going to be a more tense confrontation? And I would also ask us to think about, and I will be upfront, these are the kinds of things that literally just drove me crazy. But some of us, I think, are familiar with like deinstitutionalization. And so they changed the laws. I understand why they wanted to give people more rights or options when it came to being detained, to have your mental health diagnosis addressed. I get it. But what ended up happening was you had tons of people, a lot of them poor, who didn't have a lot of insurance options. That meant they could, stay in a decent facility. Were just pushed out onto the street, and they ended up being something that law enforcement had to deal with. And I don't think we're the first in Rochester where we see that pattern, where people had good intentions, but the end result, it may not have been, the racism may not have been the intent, but that was the end result. You have poor people, a lot of people of color with behavioral health issues, not a lot of options, that ended up in the justice process. And we've kicked that can down the road, and look where we are. So for me, when I left law enforcement, like I said, the first time, it was because I really wanted to make a difference. I didn't think I could do it in uniform. I thought I had to go somewhere where I could have an impact in policy and training, and be able to fight the good fight that way. So I yield to my colleague. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you so much. And that behavioral health, mental illness, and all of that is, it is very serious. In fact, last month we hosted a show with different counselors and different specialists who deal with mental illness, and really how people need to get help admitting that they have an issue, understanding what you just said as far as the self-medication. They don't realize that taking a drug is exacerbating the already issue that they have. And like you said, if they don't have insurance or what have you, then they're going to go to the next best thing. And I know, like back in the day, growing up in Detroit, I would hear, people saying, oh, we put so-and-so up in such, some mental house. Or you hear about some old person that was there because they had some mental issues. Like, I don't think those exist anymore, at least in Michigan. I don't know, Chief Barren, but I remember there was one, I think it was Northville or something. They shut that stuff down. So now they're all in the streets now. And now this is something that you have to deal with. And then you have to distinguish, is this a mental illness case, or is this a person that's just, criminal and violent and dangerous? And they could be the same, depending on the situation. That's a tough job. And, I think, like, well, does there need to be like a special department that just deals with mental illness? Is it, we need to bring these institutions back? I mean, I'm not going to get to the Q&A section yet, but that one is important to me because especially with this COVID out here, and people just are acting wild. That's all I got to say. I mean, I've seen some behaviors and things with people due to being locked in and under quarantine and not sure about if they can wear a mask, not wear a mask, and all this craziness going on. And a lot of, like you said, Chief Barren, the road rage, people killing and shooting people on the highways and just doing all that kind of stuff. I think it's all wrapped up in that whole mental illness, behavioral, undiagnosed, all of that. And so it's like a whole probably separate show. But we're going to get to Assistant Commissioner Hodges because we could probably talk about that theme right there all day long. But I do want to spend some time with you, Assistant Commissioner Hodges. You say you don't like the word police reform. You prefer the word police alignment. And that relationship needs to be restored between the police and the neighbors. And this will require a commitment on both sides with open and honest dialogue. And to that, you have a 3-step approach. 1, to develop a set of shared values. 2, consider residency requirements. And then 3, rethink where we bring the tail of the criminal justice system. Can you elaborate on those 3 points for us?
No. So, sorry, I seriously, I joke around all the time. I think, one of the things that I always find enjoyable about this job is if you literally came to my office, you would find people laughing all the time. So I think that's just, we can be serious. I mean, we need to be serious when we need to be, but the jovialness of the workforce is something I really believe in. But so to the question, so I don't like the term reform. We've already had the reform era of policing going back in the 1930s. It's time to really, how have we gotten where we've gotten, right? We've gotten out of alignment with the communities that we serve. And what I mean by that, the values that the police department has in some instances are not in alignment with the communities that they serve. For example, this term respect, right? So in Minnesota, what we did when I was under sheriff, we also had this values conversation with the community. So we made sure that we got on the same page with values. And then recently in Minnesota, we did a statewide listening tour where we went to all areas of the state, each of the congressional districts, and we asked the communities in those districts what character traits you would like to see in your state police officers that would increase trust and legitimacy amongst, or I shouldn't say increase trust, it's just build and maintain upon the trust, because by and large, people do trust the state law enforcement officers in Minnesota, because the 1,400 people that work in these divisions they do a phenomenal job, and they've consistently done what they needed to do to be in alignment with the community. But essentially, when we went and asked the community what values that they want to see, first and foremost was empathy, respect, leadership, and being a servant to the community. So when you look at these values, when you develop the mission, vision, and values for your department, they should reflect those values that the community has. So I'll give you an example. The one that I always like to use is the term respect, right? So if the community and the police department both agree that respect is a value, as a chief, it is easy for me to give my officers direction in terms of what are the 4 corners of the police department in terms of what are our values, right? So if they want to do something, I say, does it align with our core values of respect, right? If you get in trouble, right? Did you violate respect, right? And it's easy to deal with that. And at the same token, to put this in the communities, because, and I say this all the time, my officers and troopers, BCA agents, they don't get to disrespect you, period. You need to expect respect, period. But at the same time, you don't get to disrespect them. And that's the thing that we got to get back to in our communities, is this notion of promoting respect, right? So shared values, I really believe, is the key to getting us back in alignment with our communities. And it's a discussion that you have to have every couple of years, because a lot of things people don't understand. People watch Minneapolis on TV, and I was born and raised in Minneapolis. My family's been there since the late 1940s. But by and large, Minneapolis the city is a transient city. You get a lot of people from Chicago and Detroit that come here, and people just cycle out of Minneapolis, whereas our sister city, St. Paul, across the river, doesn't have that notion going on over there. So it's a little bit more stable. But the residency piece, most people may not realize that residency requirements first started in the 1970s to prevent white flight. So basically what they did was, in these cities, they put these residency requirements in place because a lot of the white officers were leaving the cities and going to the suburbs to live. Residency requirements, I firmly believe that police officers should live where they work. And the notion I use is 15 miles or 15 minutes. And I've always lived where I work. And I say that because what type of message does that send to the community if you want to be a police officer there, but the place is not even worth you living in, right? You can get your money there, but you can't live there, right? And I mean, I think, and I've heard my first day as chief, I remember I had my windows open in my office, and the officers came in like an intervention, and they're like, "Chief, why you got your windows open?" I'm like, "Because it's sun out and it's Minnesota, I need some vitamin D." And they said, "No, you can't have your windows open because someone might get you." I'm like, "Get me? If I can't be safe in my office and I'm worried about someone getting me," I said, "No, we can't do that," right? So we can't. I get the notions, I hear all the arguments, and I just think we got to really, I believe that you should live where you work. In some cities, I realize that's not practical because officers don't make the wage that's compensated enough to be able to live in some of these places. In those instances, cities need to take steps to make sure that cops can live in the cities. And for cops, I always say this: if you go back to people always talk about police unions, right? The true power of police unions came from residency, when cops lived in the city, because elected officials knew that if they crossed the police, right? And I'm not saying this is good or bad thing, but if they crossed the police, that the police had political influence and could really be impactful in elections moving forward. Well, now in areas where you don't have police officers who don't live in these areas, the police union is null and void in terms of affecting elections. And I can tell you, I've seen that firsthand here in our core cities in Minnesota. And then lastly, the tail of the criminal justice system. I say everywhere I go as a police officer, I bring the tail of the criminal justice system with me. And I ask the question is, why should we be bringing the tail of the criminal justice system into some of these instances, right? So the 13-year-old kid that doesn't want to go to school, does the criminal justice system need to be brought into that situation? I say no, because what happens if, as a cop, if I go in there and this kid pushes me, right? I mean, me personally, I'm going to be like, whatever, it's not that big of a deal. But there's other officers who it is going to be a big deal to, right? And I look at mental health calls, and I say this, and I know a lot of times chiefs don't agree with me on it. I know I'm kind of on an island somewhat, but I just don't believe that police officers should respond to nonviolent mental health calls, period. There's no need, for one, I'm CIT trained. I've been a CIT instructor for 16 years. I have a doctorate degree that has nothing to do with mental health. And I say that the people who go to school to deal with people experiencing severe mental illness go to school for 12 years. And we're going to expect a police officer with 40 hours of training to go in there and be able to diffuse that situation. It's as well-intentioned as we are, it's just a bad situation. And I know you were talking earlier about the hospitals being shut down. In Minnesota, we are dealing with this now because they're looking at our recently passed use of force, deadly force encounters, or deadly force legislation states that it is illegal for a police officer essentially to be involved or use deadly force against a person who is experiencing a mental illness or who may be suicidal. That's the way the statute is. So now what's happening is cops and police departments aren't responding to those mental health calls. And now the mental health advocates are coming in and saying, well, why aren't you responding to these calls? You're sending the medics out to them. Well, the law is what the law is, right? So I think, as we have these discussions about alignment, that's one of the key components is where do we really want the criminal justice system to go, and where don't we want it to go?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that insight. I think all of you have hit on some really serious situations, and you have some really good solutions in mind on how we can potentially move forward. And I know you guys are doing a great job in your communities that you serve, and us as well as your officers. And it's just that message that has to just be disseminated. And I know there's tons of conferences you all attend, and I'm sure you have discussions and panels, but I think to your points that this has to become the new way of, operating when it comes to the community. Because I mean, I respect law enforcement. I always have. As a couple of people on here have seen me at several Noble conferences and whatnot. I know what you guys do, and it's awesome. I mean, I tip my hat off to you, and it's a tough job. I mean, I know if I deal with somebody that's acting out at the grocery store, I'm trying to retreat, but that you guys can't do that. You have to step in and you have to deal. And like you said, Assistant Commissioner, they could have a mental situation. They could just be a bad person. They could be, you don't even know all of this. And it's like, without the proper training, how can you best really serve the people? And then you get all this ridicule from the community that, oh, they were too brutal, they did too much, this person was mental and all this, and you don't know that when you're going in. So these are split-second decisions that you have to make, and they are life and death related. So I know it's a tough job. So I just say thank you for everything that you do, and everyone on your team of what they do in terms of trying to keep us safe. With that, I'm sure there's tons of questions on the line here. I'm going to pass it over to my moderator, Angela Peavy. If you could grab a couple of those questions from the viewers that have been watching the show.
Well, it's more than a couple, but the
Okay.
first one in is for Chief Barren. Allie Hughes asked, are you looking to put more police accountability policies in place, such as banning chokeholds, providing a data transparency system that will give the community access to traffic stops that don't result in citations, as well as data showing status of complaints?
Absolutely. And so the Southfield Police Department is currently on par with the national best standards in policing. And so let me give you an example. And so upon my arrival in the Southfield Police Department, I remember I did serve 21 years with the Detroit Police Department, where I was part of a 13-year federal oversight by the federal monitors. Out of that time frame, I was well aware of what the national best standards are. And so when I arrived into the city of Southfield and started reviewing the Southfield policies, it stood out to me that I had to make some very quick revisions. And we use this word called courage. That's what we have to do, because changing policy does upset people at times because you're changing the norms. So I went very quickly, changed the pursuit policy, banned the chokeholds. I even sat down with community advocates in the community with our policies, and actually the community helped me add 2 more policies in that I didn't have that was in alignment with 8 Can't Wait. So yes, it's very important that we ensure that the bans on chokeholds, neck restraints are implemented. But I'm gonna finish with this because it's important that you all know this. I don't care what policy you put in place. If you don't have frontline supervision, the sergeants, the lieutenants out in the field monitoring behavior and having the courage, I'm gonna keep using that word, to discipline or change that behavior, we're gonna end up right back in the situation. And that's why it's important for we as police chiefs to be held accountable for our courage, to make sure that we're setting the right tone for the organization. And then finally, it was mentioned about access to the community as relates to traffic stops. So we are working with Oakland County with that particular program. We're in the last stages of that, but there's a dashboard for the community to see that type of reports. So yes, that's happening as well.
Okay. Here's one from Sonia Davis Dillard. I'm going to skip around because there's like a few for Chief Barren specifically, but I want to be able to get some of the other panelists to answer this question. So any panelist can answer. Sonia Davis Dillard asks, how long do you think it will take before a positive culture shift in relationships, I guess, happen between community and law enforcement? Any panelists?
So here's the analogy I like to use in this, and I'm not trying to be rude, but this is what I typically say, right? You can't have a fact argument with an emotional person, and you can't have an emotional argument with a fact person, right? Until we can get to the point where we can have this argument in the middle and actually come together and have a discussion, that's going to break down what we need to get to. And I can tell you, like Minnesota, since between 2015 and 2020, 12 African Americans have lost their lives in deadly force encounters with law enforcement in our state. During the same time period, we've had 369 African Americans that have lost their lives as a result of homicides. And for me, I've always believed this, that I've had all Black lives matter, period. One of the 12 deaths is one too many as far as I'm concerned. The 369 is more, one of those is too much as far as I'm concerned. I've had the opportunity, or whatever you want to call it, to call a family who one of our deputies had got involved in a deadly force encounter with. I've had to call families who's lost their loved one as a result of street violence. And I can tell you that their cries are the same. They go in the same dirt. And I just think that if we get to this point where we can actually have this conversation in the middle, because what happens is, and you can kind of see it happening throughout the country, we go far one way, right? And then we go too far, and then the pendulum swings back. Yeah. And now we're sitting and trying to deal with that. I mean, you look right now, we're still digging out from the high crime area, right? 3 strikes, you're out, incarcerating juveniles when they're earlier. We're still digging out from that now. So I just want to make sure that things we do now, 20, 30 years, we're not digging out from. But I think I'm hopefully optimistic. I think, if we can get together and really have some dialogue, and those of us in leadership need to have real conversations and not be politically correct sometimes. And we need to be able to take the criticism that comes with and just have honest dialogues with our communities, because that's what they want.
And can I get one more in there, Michelle?
Girl, go ahead.
Okay, this one is from Val Fain. Chief Barren, is there now a standard of governing governing the release, I guess, for the release of tapes from police officer body cam footage? And are all officers utilizing the same standard equipment?
So the reforms will dictate the national standard to when body cameras are released. Right now, different states do things differently, as you see in some of the local cases, particularly out of, we'll say, out of North Carolina.
Elizabeth City.
Right, where judge made a decision. He was able to make that call and body cams be released. Some police departments have more latitude, as you see. Chief James Craig in Detroit released body cams right away. Certainly, I did follow a similar model when I had an allegation of police misconduct in the Southfield Police Department. I released that video the next day to assure the public that that particular attorney was being very untruthful as how he described the incident. And so, again, it depends on the state as of now, but the reforms moving forward will have some type of consistency as to when those should or should not be released.
Okay, and one other follow-up, kind of along the same lines. Are all officers nationally receiving some type of standardized training? And if so, what do they pertain to? What training nationally are all officers getting?
that a question for me? Okay, so yes, officers are receiving standard training. Again, you got to go by states as well. For example, I'm in Michigan. Our state have a standard practices for training that we have to uphold, whether it's a time, hours allotted, and then the curriculum. So we mentioned mental health earlier. So there's training as related to mental health. There's training that is consistent with use of force. So all of the national concerns, officers do receive a allotted time for training. But as Assistant Director Hodges did mention, that training is only for a few hours. So we do need the help of the professionals to help us deal with, let's say, responding to mental health calls for service. And I'll give you an example very quickly. Right now, in the Southfield Police Department, we are in the stages of having a mental health professional hired in to help us. Because as mentioned, although many or most calls for service related to mental health are non-violent, there are some that are violent. And we do need a professional to assist us with those calls for service because they're the experts. And so those are things that we're trying to move forward with in police. And I think many agencies have adopted similar models, but it's just one stage without taking up too much time that shows how we are receiving national training in critical areas in law enforcement response.
That's all from Facebook for now.
Okay. Just checking it one last time. People are liking the show, though. I'm getting a lot of good feedback. So the panelists, you are hitting on some things, I guess, that people have been thinking about, which is good. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I'm just going once, going twice, then we can actually close out the show here. But before we do that, I'd like to give a 30-second kind of wrap-up statement or a takeaway from each panelist that you may want to share with the Facebook community here. I'll start with you, Chief Barren.
And I'll just start off just thanking you, Michelle, for reaching out to me, certainly your staff for putting this all together, and definitely the other distinguished panelists on this call, because collectively is how reforms begin. And so a question came up about a time frame. So we really can't give you a time frame. I want to remind the viewing audience that there are over 18,000 police departments in this country and over 800,000 police officers, and most of which are in rural areas, small departments. And so we talked about that culture that we need to change, because racism is a part of America. Some folks don't want to admit that. I know very recently we saw a senator say that it doesn't exist in America. We all know that that is not accurate. It does exist. It has found its way in police departments, and there's a culture of that depending on what agency you're referring to. And so the commitment that I will have for you is that this police chief will continue to be one of courage, one honest with the community. If a member needs to be held accountable, it will take shape. If I need to explain to you what happened by showing video and talking policies and procedures, I'll do that. But rest assured, you will be able to trust this police chief if there's a critical incident in the city of Southfield.
Thank you, Chief Barren. I'm going to go to Chief Davis now.
I'm going to echo my brother Chief there, and thank you for inviting me here. It's an honor to be on such a distinguished panel. And Angela, I'm sorry for not recognizing you earlier, but thank you as well. The thing that I want to leave everybody with is I mentioned earlier that I was blessed to be able to sit on, do an interview with the Chicago Defender, which is one of the oldest Black newspapers in the country, earlier today with Jacob Blake Sr. And the interviewer asked me as we were closing out, what can I as a citizen do in this whole process to have some impact on reform or change within law enforcement? And the thing that I recommended is that if there's just real fundamentally, that you see these chiefs, these Black chiefs that are out here, we're in harmony. We didn't rehearse this. We are out there on the front line unapologetically speaking our truth as Black folks and as law enforcement executives. We're going to do what we do. That's not going to change. But what you can do as a citizen is you can show your support for us. Because I know my colleagues are the same way. At the levels that we're at, we're the only one in the room. And we're the only one in the, especially not just the only one in the room, we're the only one in the room speaking the language that we're speaking. And it becomes uncomfortable, you know, and it pisses people off, quite honestly. But, you know, we're going to do what we do. But anything that you could do, because we're going to turn this around by having this profession being infiltrated with right-minded people. And how do we do that? While we have people out there that are holding us accountable for officers who may do things they got no business doing, at the same, you know what, when you're done saying that, we need your help in that, hey, there are good officers out there that are fighting the fight for us, because we're on the front lines for you all. And once again, we're going to continue to do what we do. But with that support, it changes the narrative, because there's so many colleagues that don't look like us. The first thing, and I talk about this, is that they say, when they hear the word reform, they automatically say that you don't like police. But that's not true. That's absolutely not true. People want the police in the right way. And so with that support, we need you all to speak out to support us while we're standing out front, which we're going to do anyway. And I'd like to thank you all for being on here and just listening to what we have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll move now to Chief Herriott-Sullivan.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me on the show. I enjoyed spending time with everyone. I'm going to stress that people make sure that they have a voice in the process and in managing their departments. Pay attention to the budget. When programs they want to cut or move, and you see the value, be present, know how the process works, and object to it. I believe that a big reason that we're in the position we're in right now is that we weren't in the room, we didn't make sure we were in the room, and that when programs that kept people out of the justice system were cut, then there were no voices to be heard. When you look at things like transparency and how the body-worn camera process works, how it's shared with the community, because you know, you've seen this on one state, I forget which one, that they have a law that dictates how the body-worn camera can be released, and there's been a lot of controversy, and people were pretty upset because they had an expectation. I think because, like many of us, even for us here in Rochester, we've had some controversial cases that are still pending. But my commitment is, we may not look great, but guess what? We're going to put it out there. We're going to put it out there. And so pieces and processes like that, that if you want to have a voice, you've got to make sure you're in the room. I think Assistant Commissioner Hobbs talked about not liking defunding. I don't like it either, because often the question is, well, when you say it, what do you mean by it? But I would go further to say that defunding is about writing what, in people's minds, writing what they felt were programs getting shortchanged over time. And I'm saying, make sure you're paying attention to the budget in your towns and cities, and that when there are cuts, if you want, that's when you make your case not to cut the programs, keep the funding where it is, so we don't find ourselves kicking the can down the road and we have major issues in parts of our communities that actually had a nice process in place to deal with those kinds of things. So the best I could offer, even though we're talking about law enforcement, but I still say we can go a long way in addressing issues like that if we make sure we're in the room, we pay attention how the budget process works, how our government works, our local governments, and you let people know that you're paying attention you're keeping an eye on things. That I would say that's the best feedback I could offer. And thanks again, Michelle, and your staff for having us here.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
Mhm.
And lastly, we're gonna close out the panel with Assistant Commissioner Hodges. Any last thoughts for our SMAC Nation?
Yeah, so first, thanks for having me. Good panel. Discussions are always good. And I just want to leave everybody with this. One of my younger members said to me, this notion of exterior pressure being able to create interior change. And she said if that was successful, the show Intervention would have 100% positivity rate where these people are magically cured of what's taking place. And when she said that, it really hit me. You know, I've had a front row seat here to riots, people burning down buildings. The external change is fine, but in order for this to really work, we're going to need internal change. And the only way we're going to get internal change is I can't be the only one in the room. When we post for jobs, we can't have one Black applicant out of 100. We need people to come join this profession so we can start to change this profession from both the outside and the inside, because true change is going to come from the inside. And Chief Davis has said it best, you know, when he talked about being in the room and making statements and speaking up for issues and being uncomfortable. And I can tell you, for those in leadership, I just think that, you know, throughout your career, and I know for me, being that person, it isolates you, right? And I believe the Lord isolates you. So when you get in that position, because everybody here can attest to, being in leadership is lonely at the top, right? And I think that isolation is preparation for that. But we need people to come join this profession and help provide safety and security to their communities. If you continue to depend on other people to provide safety and security to your communities, don't be surprised when we're having this conversation 20 years from now. Ultimately, change comes from within. If external change work, just like one of our younger members had said to me, addiction clinics, intervention shows would be very successful at rehabilitating addicts if that was successful. And we all know, and I can tell you from my own personal experience with family members, it wasn't until that person, all the external pressure we give them, it wasn't until that person had really decided to make that individual change themselves. So join the profession. We need us to protect our communities.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And so I think we have yet another successful show.
Except,
Except.
no, we had a great show.
Oh.
When you were counting down, going once, going twice, I think Allie Hughes couldn't type fast enough.
Oh.
And so when you went in, so can we sneak this one last question in for Allie?
Let's see.
And then there's maybe just a 20-second answer, short bite from somebody.
Okay.
Okay. Allie asks, what are y'all's thoughts on having a citizen-led independent review board with subpoena power that can review misconduct, complaints, and video footage? Having an independent review board would show your commitment to being held accountable.
I don't mind jumping in quick on that. Somebody else can weigh in, but we've got one that they're working on to get started. But what I would just caution is that if a panel like that is to have any credibility, you have to, or the people you appoint have to be impartial. You can't go around making biased statements and negative statements about hating the police, but then sit on a board like that and expect that you're gonna convince people that you're gonna provide due process. That's critical. I would love to see the community's input on that. I really would, but it's so critical that you gotta understand that you got an obligation to provide due process. Otherwise, it really defeats the process before it's even gotten started. So I would just offer that.
Very good, thank you. Anybody else want to chime in, or are we good with that?
I'll just add one thing to this, because this always comes up. Citizens oversight boards historically have not worked, right? I mean, one of the things that I do think works, and we do this here at the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, is all internal affairs investigations are handled by the umbrella Department of Public Safety and not handled by an agency. So for example, if someone has a complaint against a state trooper, that is investigated outside of the agency. And why do we do that? Things with employment like subpoena power, employee rights, right? Whenever you have citizen oversight committees that try to wade into that space, all those issues come into play, and that kind of derails them from being successful. So having this set up completely outside of the agencies, we found to be work out pretty well.
That's got potential. I like that.
Very good. All right, well, thank you, Angela, for sneaking that last one in for us. And thank you again, panelists, Chief Barren, Chief Davis, Chief Herriott-Sullivan, Assistant Commissioner Hodges, my moderator, Angela Peavy, my technical supervisor, Willis Peavy, her husband. And a special thanks goes out to my friend Greg Coleman, who helped me get Assistant Commissioner Hodges here today. I really appreciate that. And of course, everyone out there in SMAC Nation, thank you so much. Our next show will be next month, and it's in the works as we speak. It is entitled A God for All People, Every Tribe, Every Tongue, Every Nation, and that's a question mark. And that will air on Thursday, June 17th at 7 p.m. right here on SMAC Nation. And if you missed this taping, or your friends missed it, family missed it, or perhaps you came in halfway through and you want to see the whole thing, this will be recorded and are stored on SMAC Talk, as well as on our YouTube channel. And I will put those links in SMAC Productions so that you can have access to that. And with that, I think we're done here. And I'd like to just say thank you and good night.
Good night. Bye, everybody.
Bye.